The old trail road was quiet under the fading sun, carrying only the soft crunch of dust beneath the boots of a lone guard who had seen too many winters and too many broken promises. He had come to this region of the frontier for money and nothing else. Or at least that was what he told himself whenever the wind pushed memories toward him. People whispered that he did not fear bullets or blades, and that he could stare danger in the face without blinking. Maybe that was why he was chosen. Maybe that was why they handed him extra coins and told him to watch over a captured Apache woman with no mercy and no questions. He told himself it was only a job. The border towns had grown wild with fear and rumors, and anyone from the Apache tribes was treated like a walking threat even before they spoke a single word. Folks around the campfire swore she was fierce and untamable, a spirit born straight from the wilderness. The men who hired him said she was dangerous and full of rage, but no one mentioned that she was young, wounded, and chained like someone who no longer remembered kindness. He expected to see a warrior with fire in her eyes, holding her chin high with unbreakable pride. Instead, he found a woman sitting silently in the shadows of an abandoned barn, her wrists scarred from ropes that had been pulled too tight for too long. She did not scream, threaten, or spit. She did not even look at him right away. She focused on breathing, slow and careful, as if each breath was borrowed. For a long moment, he forgot the coins in his pocket and stared quietly. There was no monster here. No savage force that matched the stories. Only a person whose world had been taken apart piece by piece. A stranger from a different culture, yes, but not someone who deserved the chains wrapped around her like a sentence she never agreed to. He stood near the entrance, trying to decide how close he should go. The men of the town expected him to guard her with rough power, show no sympathy, and strike her if she dared to move. They believed it was the only language she could understand. Yet the guard had traveled far and seen too many hearts ruined by blind hatred. He did not trust tales born out of fear. He spoke softly, asking if she needed water, but she gave no answer. Her hair was tangled, her clothes torn, and her feet bare against the cold dirt floor. She might not have understood his language, or maybe she did and refused to waste her voice on someone who stood between her and freedom as night crawled over the land. He lit a small fire outside the barn, not close enough to intimidate her, but near enough to show that she would not be left in complete darkness. Coyotes howled in the hills and the sky grew filled with silent stars. It was the kind of night where a person could feel the earth breathing and where memories could slip through cracks like smoke. He wondered what she had seen before arriving here. Had she lived near a river, danced at tribal gatherings, or helped her family prepare food near a warm fire? Maybe she had dreams of her own, dreams that no one cared to ask about. He could not shake the question. Why did they take her? What did they want from her? And what did they gain by keeping her tied like an animal? The men who hired him claimed she was connected to a conflict on the far side of the valley. They said she came from a group that refused to leave their sacred land. She was taken to pressure her people or to trade her for territory. Something about that story made his chest tighten. She was not an object or a tool, yet here she was, treated like one by men drunk on authority and fear. He stared at her again, and for a second, she lifted her eyes. There was no defeat in them, and no surrender either. Only quiet resistance, calm and steady, like a rooted tree. She did not plead, she did not shiver, and she did not act hopeless. That look told him she still belonged to her own spirit, no matter what ropes tried to claim her. When he brought food and placed it near her, she did not touch it at first. His hand moved back slowly, palms open so she could see he meant no harm. Eventually she reached for it with careful fingers, but she ate without turning from the wall, still expecting pain. He sat near the doorway with his rifle across his knees. It was part of his duty, yet he felt like the weapon now separated two worlds instead of guarding anything useful. He wondered how the land would be if people listened more and feared less. Frontier life had taught him many things, and one truth never changed. A person becomes what others push them to be. Treat someone like an enemy and soon they react like one. He could not blame her for her silence. Nor could he pretend he did not feel the weight of what was happening. The next morning he untied her hands for a moment to wash her wounds. She tensed, expecting cruelty, but he worked gently, using cloth and clean water. She watched him with confusion, as though she had forgotten what kindness looked like. When he placed the cloth aside, he stepped back so she would feel no threat. For a brief instant, she looked straight into his eyes. Not with hatred, but with a question he could not read. That moment stayed in him like a spark trapped in dry wood. Something inside him shifted, slow but powerful. He no longer saw her as a task or a prisoner. He saw someone who had been wronged. Someone who deserved a chance to live free, learn, love, speak, dance, or simply breathe without shackles cutting into her skin. He remembered his promise to himself. Long ago, when he decided never to harm anyone who could not defend themselves. He had been paid to guard her and make sure she did not escape. Yet every beat of his heart whispered a different truth. Maybe his duty was not to protect the barn or follow cruel orders. Maybe his duty was to protect what was right. The coins in his pocket suddenly felt heavy like stones filled with shame. He thought about the men who would return in a few days, expecting her to be broken in spirit so they could use her for leverage. He knew they would laugh at compassion and call him weak if they discovered he cared for her safety. They would take her away to a place with no hope. And he would be responsible for letting it happen. He sat outside and closed his eyes, listening to the night wind. Freedom was sacred in the frontier, and people fought hard for it. Houses could be rebuilt, but broken souls were harder to heal. The idea that he might be part of her suffering made his stomach twist. He stood again, looking at the ropes, then at the sky, then at her quiet form in the shadows. A decision began to take shape inside him, growing stronger with every breath. He would not allow anyone to destroy another innocent life in front of him. He had no grand plan yet, no map, no allies, and no guarantee they could outrun the dangers chasing them. All he knew was one truth that no coin could erase. He had to find a way to set her free before it was too late. Even if it meant turning against the very men who trusted him. Even if it meant facing the wilderness with someone who might never trust him back. The fire near his boots crackled as if listening, and the stars above seemed to wait for his next move. His hand reached slowly toward the rope, heart pounding, unsure if this choice would save them or destroy them both. He froze before touching the rope, feeling like something unseen was watching from the tree line, judging every decision. The barn smelled of dust, old timber, and dry soil, and the faint sound of distant river water whispered like a warning. His hand fell back to his side as he sat near the doorway again, needing to think longer. The world outside seemed so simple when spoken around saloons and trading posts, where men shouted claims about bravery and justice, yet none of them ever stood face to face with the truth they helped create. He wanted to do the right thing, but he had to understand what that meant before risking both of their lives. He could not let his heart guide him blindly when there were rifles, traps, and hateful minds waiting on every trail. He looked at her again, noticing small details he had missed before. She looked tired, but her eyes never lost alertness. She seemed to be listening to every wind shift, every owl call, every distant hoof strike. She was trained by nature, not walls. She was someone who learned from the world rather than other people's rules. For the first time, he began to wonder what story she carried before she was taken, and whether she had family or a village looking for her. He remembered how the men spoke about her like she was a trophy, proof they had power over something wild. But he now understood she was not wild. She was simply not like them. She came from a different way of living. The difference did not make her wrong. He tried speaking again, slow and steady, hoping she would understand tone, even if not words. He told her he was not like those who brought her here. He said he did not wish to hurt her. She watched him like she was measuring the truth behind his breath. He pointed toward the moon and said it reminded him that all people shared the same sky, no matter their tribe or skin. Something in her gaze softened for a second, but she quickly hid it, refusing to trust too easily. He respected that. Trust was not something that came from gentle words alone. It had to be earned step by step, especially when life had already carved fear into her memory. Days passed, and no one returned yet. He used that time to slowly make changes. He loosened her ropes so her skin would not swell, though he kept them tight enough to avoid suspicion if someone walked in. He offered clean water from a nearby spring and gave her the better half of his food, claiming he was not hungry when in truth he ate less. She watched every move and seemed to study him like he was a puzzle. Sometimes she looked away when he caught her staring, yet other times she met his eyes, as if she wanted to understand him fully. There were moments when he saw silent questions in her expression, as if she wondered why he cared when he had been paid not to. One afternoon he decided to speak openly. Even though she might not understand his language, he told her about the life he once had far from here, where he worked as a ranch hand and dreamed of owning land one day. He spoke about betrayal from someone he trusted, how it forced him to travel alone and lose faith in others. He confessed how he came to believe that dreams were for those who had someone to protect them. She listened without interrupting, sitting still and letting the wind move around her like a quiet shield. He did not realize he was telling her more than he had ever shared with anyone since leaving that life behind. Maybe it was because she could not gossip or twist his story. Maybe it was because her silence made her feel safe to talk to. Or maybe it was because he sensed a strange connection forming between two souls who did not belong to the world around them. At night, he sat outside and wondered if anyone would understand why he felt torn. He remembered hearing stories about how some settlers had peaceful relationships with indigenous tribes, trading goods and knowledge across firelight. Those stories felt distant now, overtaken by greed, land hunger, and harsh laws that placed survival above kindness. The frontier was not gentle anymore. It was turning into a place where people forgot how to feel. He feared that soon no one would remember humanity at all. If he followed orders and delivered her without resistance, he would be joining that world. If he freed her, he might face hunters, bounty riders, or even death. Yet one path felt like a betrayal of his own spirit, while the other felt like the only chance to reclaim it. One evening he noticed she was staring at a small bird, perched near the barn window. The way her eyes followed the movement told him everything. She needed freedom the way birds needed wind. He picked up a small piece of dried wood and carved a shape of a bird with his knife. It was rough and simple, yet it held meaning. When he placed it near her, she hesitated but then picked it up gently. She held it in her palm like it was a message, and for the first time he saw something close to gratitude in her expression. She whispered a soft word in her language, and though he could not understand it, he felt the warmth behind it. That small connection changed the air between them. She was no longer only a prisoner, and he was no longer simply a guard. Still there was danger. A rider came by one afternoon, saying the men who captured her were planning to return soon with new orders. The rider did not stay long, but his message sank deep. The guard walked back to the barn with heavy footsteps, knowing time was slipping away. She sensed the tension in his body and sat straighter, prepared for something unknown. He did not tell her right away because he needed to think, but she could read emotions without language. She watched him sharpen his knife, not as a weapon, but as a nervous habit. She watched him check his saddlebag and look toward the forest more than usual. She noticed everything, proving she was far more aware than her captors believed. He wished he understood her tongue so he could ask about her home, her people, and her past. He wanted to know whether someone waited for her. He tried drawing shapes on the dirt floor instead. He drew mountains and rivers. She pointed to one side, then tapped her chest, telling him where she came from. He then drew a circle with stick figures around it. She tapped one of the figures gently, then placed her hand over her heart, showing she had family. He tapped his chest too, admitting he once had one as well. Something about that silent exchange showed how similar they were, even if their worlds were different. As night returned, he sat inside the barn for the first time, not afraid of crossing boundaries anymore. She did not move away or show discomfort. He asked with gestures if she was ever harmed by those who captured her. She lowered her gaze and stayed quiet, a silence that answered more than words could. He felt fire rising inside him, not against her culture, but against those who used cruelty to get power. He knew he had to act, but the risk was high. They were alone against a town that feared her existence, and men who believed control mattered more than justice. He spent the next morning preparing small, supplies he might need if they fled. He gathered dried meat, flint herbs, and thin rope. He filled a water skin from the spring and hid everything in one corner, hoping she did not think he was planning something cruel. When she saw the items, she looked at him with eyes that asked for clarity. He pressed his hand against his chest and said softly that he wanted to help. She studied him a long time, searching for lies, but found none. Finally, she nodded once. It's a small but powerful gesture that showed she was willing to trust him at least enough to listen. The forest around them held both safety and danger. If they ran, they could vanish between pine trees and rocky ledges where few dared to track. But winter winds were growing stronger, and animals roamed freely at night. The mountains would not forgive mistakes. He needed her guidance, yet she needed his protection until she could stand safe with her people. Their lives were now tied together whether they planned it or not. He tightened his boots, checked his rifle, and took one last look at the barn walls that held so many secrets. The sky above them was turning darker, as if warning that decisions had consequences carved deep in the land. He knew the men would return soon, and he could not wait for them to decide her fate. As he walked slowly toward her and placed his hand near the rope once again, he understood this was the moment where everything would change for him, for her, and for anyone who dared to chase them through the untamed frontier. He waited until the moon was high before doing anything more. The barn was quiet except for the slow breathing of the woman who sat in the corner watching his every move. The wind outside rattled the thin wood, and for a moment he wondered if the land itself was warning him. He had lived long enough to know the frontier did not forgive foolish decisions. Every trail, every river crossing, every stranger carried some kind of risk, and it was usually the kind that could end a person's life without leaving time for regrets. Yet the thought of leaving her in chains felt heavier than any danger waiting outside. He finally spoke with a steady voice, telling her he planned to cut the ropes before sunrise. She did not move, but her eyes filled with a quiet readiness, like someone who had been preparing for this moment long before he ever arrived. He lifted his knife and slowly sliced through the last knot around her wrists. She rubbed her skin gently, wincing at the marks left behind, but she did not make any sudden move to escape. Instead, she stood slowly, keeping distance while watching him. He took a step back, to show she was free to decide how close she wanted to be. She looked toward the barn door, then at him, as if wondering whether she was walking toward life or another trap. Before either could speak, the sound of distant horses drifted through the night air. It was faint, but real enough to tighten both their chests. He whispered for her to stay quiet and stepped outside with his rifle. Lantern light flickered from the nearby ridge, moving like a restless firefly. It meant riders were making their way toward the valley, and no traveler rode this late without a purpose. He moved back inside quickly. She understood without words. They had less time than he hoped. He opened the small side door of the barn that led to the rear path connecting to the old riverbank. The path was narrow and rocky, but hidden by thick brush. It was their best chance. Before they left, she picked up the small carved bird he made and held it close, as if it gave her courage. They slipped out into the night, moving quietly along the dirt path, with only moonlight to guide them. He walked ahead to clear branches while she followed, stepping lightly like she was born to move through wild land without leaving prints. They reached the riverbank but had to stop. The water was higher than usual because of recent rainstorms, and the current was strong. Crossing at night could send them downstream where jagged rocks waited. He looked toward the forest instead, where tall pines shaped a dark maze. They could hide there, but it also meant facing the unknown. She studied the woods and nodded slightly, showing she was not afraid. He trusted her instincts more than his own, so they entered the forest and walked deeper until the barn and valley disappeared behind them. Hours passed as they moved, through thick trees and tangled roots. She led at some points using her knowledge of wild plants and wind direction. They covered their tracks and listened for dangers. Their silence became a language. When she raised her hand, he stopped. When he tapped a fallen tree twice, she changed direction. The night slowly faded into early morning, painting pale light between the branches. They found a small hollow beneath an old tree where they could rest for a moment. Her breathing was steady, but he could see exhaustion in her shoulders. He gave her water and ripped his own shirt to wrap the cuts on her wrists. She touched the cloth gently, offering him a faint nod that carried more gratitude than any spoken word. While she rested, he tried to understand the path ahead. Even if they escaped the men from town, others would spread word that a guard betrayed his contract and fled with a prisoner. That meant bounty posters, search parties, and questions he could not answer without revealing the truth. He wondered what kept pushing him forward. Maybe he was tired of watching injustice. Maybe he found something worth protecting for the first time in years. Or maybe he was afraid of becoming the kind of man he once swore he would never be. When she opened her eyes, she pointed toward the northern trail with a look that said they needed to keep moving. He stood again and followed her lead, stepping carefully through frost-covered grass. After some distance, they found a small stream that cut across a rocky ridge. She stopped, dropped to one knee, and placed her hand on the stones, studying them like clues. He watched in silence, realizing she was reading the land the way other people read words. After a moment, she tapped a cluster of small round prints near the water. Deer tracks. That meant food could be nearby, and where deer moved, there were safe routes. She looked back and pointed to his boots, signaling he should walk on the stones instead of dirt to avoid leaving signs. Her knowledge became his survival as they traveled farther. He noticed she glanced behind them often, sensing movement he could not hear. He checked his rifle many times, knowing even one mistake could cost them everything. The trail curved into a valley with low bushes and wind-shaped rocks. It seemed peaceful until they saw smoke rising from the far side, not from wildfire, but from a campfire. She stiffened, unsure whether it belonged to her people or someone else. He crouched beside her, observing. The smoke was thin and controlled, meaning skilled hands tended it. But distance made it impossible to tell whether it signaled safety or danger. He turned to her and whispered that they should wait before approaching. She agreed and climbed a small rock to get a better view. While she was watching, he thought about the men behind them and how they might twist the story. They would say he was fooled or seduced. They would claim she was violent and needed to be restrained. They would never admit the truth, that she was taken without cause, and he refused to become part of their cruelty. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he was no longer running only to save her. He was running to save himself from becoming what hatred wanted him to be. Soon footsteps sounded nearby, breaking his thoughts. Not heavy like adult boots, but light like someone young or small. They both ducked low behind brush, waiting. A moment later, a young boy appeared, carrying a small basket filled with herbs and roots. The woman inhaled sharply, recognizing something familiar. When the boy caught sight of her, his eyes widened, but instead of fear, his face filled with stunned relief. He said something in her language, calling her by a name that carried deep weight. She answered softly, and tears filled the boy's eyes. The guard remained silent, understanding this was someone from her people, maybe family. The boy motioned for them to follow him toward the hidden camp. She looked at the guard with hesitation, questioning if he would go with her or leave now that she found her own. He nodded to show he was staying. Not because he expected anything, but because his heart would not allow him to abandon her halfway. She gave a small nod back, the first sign she fully accepted him as more than a stranger. They moved toward the camp. But just as they reached the ridge, the sharp snap of a distant rifle echoed across the valley. The boy froze. The guard grabbed his arm and pulled him down, shielding both him and the woman. Another rifle crack followed, this time closer. The sound came from behind. The direction they had escaped from, the chase had already begun. He whispered urgently that they must move fast, and the woman gripped the carved bird tightly, knowing their fight for freedom was only growing more dangerous. The valley ahead promised reunion, but the path behind promised hunters armed with fear, assumptions, and orders no one dared challenge. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they prepared to face whatever came next, with no guarantee that they would reach safety. No promise that their decision would end well, and no certainty about who would still be standing when dawn came again. The next moments moved like a storm with no sound, only pressure. The rifle shot that echoed through the valley reminded them that every second mattered. The boy pointed toward a narrow path between two rock walls, hidden by brush and shadow. The woman nodded and motioned for the guard to follow quickly. They stayed low, moving fast but careful, knowing any snapped branch could give them away. The guard held his rifle close, but never raised it unless forced. He did not want to become like those who hunted without heart. The narrow path twisted between tall stones shaped by wind over many years. The ground was uneven, covered with dry leaves, and every footstep sounded louder than it should. The woman moved first, guiding the boy with her hand, while the guard covered the rear. The air felt tight, heavy with fear and hope mixed together. The guard's mind raced with questions. How many riders were coming? Did they have dogs with them? Would they try to trap the valley, or burn the forest to flush them out? He had seen men do cruel things when they wanted victory more than truth. When they reached the end of the rocky path, a hidden clearing opened like a secret world. The camp was small, built with care and skill. Smoke rose gently from a covered fire, and huts made of wood and hides blended with the trees, almost invisible unless someone walked right into it. A few figures stood up when they entered, eyes wide with shock. The woman stepped forward with slow steps, while the boy ran ahead to speak urgently in their language. Murmurs spread through the camp, some filled with relief, some with caution. A tall elder stepped forward, carrying a staff decorated with feathers and beads. His face was lined with age, but his eyes carried strength. The woman lowered her head respectfully, spoke in her native tongue, explaining with calm voice and slow hands. The elder listened without interrupting, though his eyes shifted to the guard several times, reading him like an open page. When she finished, the elder approached the guard, standing close enough for him to see every detail of his weathered features. The guard lowered his rifle and placed it gently on the ground to show he meant no harm. The elder studied him for a long, quiet moment before placing his hand over his heart in a gesture of respect. The guard did the same, feeling unexpected warmth fill his chest. The elder spoke a few words, and the woman translated softly, saying that they were welcome for now, but danger followed fast. Everyone worked together quickly. They covered tracks near the clearing and prepared to move camp deeper into the mountain woods, where it would be harder to find. The boy brought water and a handful of berries, offering them to the guard with shy gratitude. The guard kneeled to accept them, feeling a strange peace mixed with the rising worry in his stomach. Every face in the camp showed both joy and fear. They had their loved one back, but at a cost they did not choose. The woman walked over and pointed to a distant ridge, saying they could hide there for a short time, but not long. The guard nodded and asked if they needed his help. She looked at him, her expression soft but serious, and said he could leave if he wanted because no one would blame him. He shook his head. He had walked too far to turn back now. This was no longer her struggle alone. Something inside him felt like he was meant to be here, meant to defend what was right, even if he lost everything else. Before they could move, the sound of horses echoed again, closer this time. The elder raised his hand and everyone fell silent. The woman listened carefully, her ear turned toward the wind, and whispered that there were more riders than before. The guard gripped his rifle, but the elder placed a hand on his shoulder, showing him they did not want a battle unless there was no other choice. They moved swiftly, guiding children and elders toward a steep hidden trail behind the camp. The woman led the group, her steps sure and confident, while the guard stayed near the back to shield them if needed as they climbed. He kept glancing down at the forest floor where shadows moved like restless spirits. He heard faint voices, maybe laughter or threats. He could not tell from that distance. A hawk cried from above, as if warning them to move faster. The trail grew steeper and rocks crumbled beneath their boots, forcing them to use roots and branches for support. The boy stumbled once, but the guard caught him by the arm and steadied him with a gentle grip. The woman looked back and met the guard's eyes for a moment, gratitude shining clear. They reached a ledge where the forest stretched far below, thick and dark. The elder signaled for them to continue higher, but the guard paused to listen. Faint voices were climbing too, slower but determined. He whispered to the woman that they might catch up before they reached true safety. She nodded, knowing it as well. She said something quietly, almost like a promise, and placed the carved bird in his hand, closing his fingers around it. He felt a spark of courage travel from his palm to his heart. They pushed on, climbing until the trail curved around a rock face, leading to a narrow plateau hidden behind cedar trees. From there, smoke from the camp could not be seen, and footprints were less visible. The elder instructed everyone to stay silent and gather close. The woman motioned to the guard to follow her to a small lookout point where they could watch the valley without being seen. They crawled forward, laying low behind stone and brush. Below them, 4 riders entered the abandoned camp. The guard recognized 2 of them. They were the same men who paid him. One held a lantern, while the other kicked over a cooking pot with irritation. They searched the huts and stomped the ground like they believed anger could pull answers from dirt. The guard clenched his jaw until his teeth hurt. The riders shouted threats into the air, as if daring anyone to answer. When no reply came, they mounted again and started searching around, their lanterns swinging like lost stars. The woman whispered that they would not stop until they found something or someone. The guard knew she was right. The riders were angry now, and angry men made desperate decisions. He tried to think of a way to distract or mislead them if needed. But the forest already held too many secrets to risk revealing new ones. As he watched, one rider studied the footprint near the edge of the clearing and pointed toward the mountains. His stomach tightened. They were heading the correct direction. The woman turned to him, her voice low and steady. She said that if anyone had to stop them, it should be someone who understood both worlds. Her meaning was clear. She believed he had to stand between danger and the people who trusted him. He looked at the carved bird still held inside his palm and felt how much weight a small piece of wood could carry when carved with real hope. He took a deep breath, knowing the next steps would decide everything. He was only one man with limited ammo, no backup, and no clear path to victory. But he also knew he could not stay hidden if the riders got too close. He had to protect the woman, the boy, and the entire camp. He whispered that he would find a way to lead the riders away and buy time. She reached out and rested her hand over his for a brief heartbeat. Showing silent faith, he stood slowly and walked to the narrow route that led back down the mountain, his boots pressing softly into the cold dirt. The forest wind brushed past his shoulders like it was testing his resolve. He did not know if he would return, but he knew he had to go. Behind him, the woman watched with eyes full of fear and trust mixed together. The elder placed his hand over his heart once again, and as the guard stepped into the shadows of the pine forest, ready to face the riders alone, the world around him grew silent, holding its breath, waiting for the moment where fate would choose who walked back to safety and who did not. He walked alone down the narrow mountain trail with slow breaths, telling himself he had already chosen the kind of man he wanted to be. His boots pressed into the cold ground, the pine branches brushed his shoulders, and his heart beat loud enough that it felt like the whole forest could hear it. He was not thinking of reward, reputation, or safety anymore. He was thinking of the woman who trusted him, the boy who looked at him with hopeful eyes, and the people who just wanted peace. He remembered how she held the small wooden bird, and how she finally believed he was not like the ones who took her. That trust was now his strength. He reached a clearing where the trail widened near a fallen log and listened for the riders. The forest wind carried distant voices. He saw their lantern light flickering between the trees, getting closer with every moment. He looked around for something that could help him. A broken branch, a different path, any sign that nature stood with him. He noticed a narrow trail off to the side leading down to marshy ground near the river. It was dangerous, but it also made footprints harder to track. He moved toward it and purposely scraped his boot against a rock to leave a sound loud enough for the riders to hear. Then he stepped deeper onto that hidden trail, leaving clear marks only for the first few feet, before carefully walking on stones and roots so his prints would fade. The voices grew louder, and soon he heard one of the men shout that they had found the trail. He moved quickly but stayed calm. He knew if he panicked, he would make mistakes. He continued down toward the marsh area where tall grass and water reflected faint moonlight. Frogs croaked nearby and the soil was damp. He stepped from root to root while doing his best not to sink or leave a long trail behind. When he reached a patch with small rocks, he crossed over them and then used a branch to swipe away the first set of tracks behind him. The riders finally reached the start of the marsh, their lantern light glowing like angry stars. They searched the ground, but the tracks slowly disappeared into the wet soil. One rider swore loudly. Another said they should try spreading out. But the leader shouted that it was too risky because the marsh could swallow a horse. They argued for a moment, and the guard felt his breathing ease slightly. He was close enough to hear them, but hidden well enough not to be seen. After several tense minutes, one rider said they should return to the main path and search farther north. Their hooves stomped, and the lantern light faded as they turned away. When he was sure they were gone, he sat down on a dry patch and closed his eyes to thank fate for helping. For the first time since he took the job, he let himself feel relief not for his own life, but for what it meant for the woman and her people. After resting for a moment, he made his way back up the mountain slowly, careful not to leave clues for anyone still searching in the distance. By the time he reached the hidden plateau, dawn had started to warm the sky with soft orange light. The woman stood near the edge, with her braid blowing in the breeze, watching the horizon. When she saw him step out from the trees, her breath caught and her eyes softened with real emotion. She walked toward him, not running, not desperate. But with a calm certainty that spoke louder than words, the elder approached and placed his hand on the guard's shoulder, whispering that the camp would be safe now because of what he chose. The boy smiled wide, gripping his small basket like a treasure. The guard felt something he had not felt in years, a quiet sense of belonging. Not because he was part of their tribe by birth, but because he proved his heart knew the value of life and respect. They guided him back to the main clearing where a small fire burned with gentle smoke. Women prepared warm broth, and one handed him a wooden bowl. He ate slowly, tasting gratitude rather than food. The woman sat beside him, no longer distant, and no longer afraid. They exchanged smiles, both understanding how far they had come. He finally asked her name using gestures and soft tone. She touched her chest and spoke it clearly. He repeated it carefully, showing her that he honored it. Then she pointed at him with a curious expression, and he told her his name as well. She repeated it, shaping the word in her own accent, making it sound like it finally belonged somewhere. For 2 days, he stayed with the tribe, helping them move deeper into safer ground. He carried firewood, fixed simple shelter frames, and joined in silent prayer circles where the elder led songs for protection. The woman and boy stood near him often, showing that he was no longer looked at as an outsider. The tribe shared wisdom about nature, respect, and balance, speaking about how every life mattered, whether human or animal, river or mountain. The guard felt like he was learning more in these quiet days than he ever learned, living among towns full of noise and pride. On the final morning, while the sun rose bright and clean over the pines, the woman handed him the small carved bird he had once gifted her. She placed it in his palm, then gently closed his hand around it. For a moment he feared she was saying goodbye, but instead she lifted her hand to her heart, then pointed to him, showing he would always be part of her story. He felt his throat tighten. He kept the bird close and understood that sometimes home was not a place, but a connection built through courage. The elder walked up and offered him a small pouch filled with herbs and seeds, saying it was a gift for new beginnings. The woman stepped closer and said softly in broken words that if he wished, he could stay with them and learn their way of life. The guard looked around at the forest, the people, the peace that filled the air. He thought about the world he came from, filled with fear, unfair judgment, and the cold weight of coins. He knew he was free to choose. This time his choice was not forced, paid, or demanded. He decided to stay. With time, he became a bridge between two worlds, carrying messages, trade goods, and understanding between settlers who were willing to listen and tribes who wanted fairness instead of conflict. The woman walked beside him in every season, not as a prisoner or someone saved, but as a guide, teacher, and trusted companion. The boy grew into a skilled tracker, proud of the man who had once been hired to guard a prisoner, but ended up guarding something far greater: peace. The guard and the woman shared not a story of possession, but of respect born from hardship. They built a small shelter near a quiet stream where birds sang and children could play without fear. He crafted many more small wooden animals over the years, but the first carved bird stayed with him always, hanging near their fire where everyone could see it. It became a reminder that kindness could rewrite any destiny. In the end, he found the life he once believed he had lost. Not on land claimed by papers, but in a community shaped by trust. The woman stood proudly beside him, forever free, forever respected. The mountains became their witness, and every evening, when the stars appeared, they looked at the sky and remembered how their journey began in a dusty barn with chains and silence, and ended in a world where both walked as equals, sharing one path. Their story became a quiet lesson whispered across the frontier, teaching anyone who listened that people are not dangerous because of where they come from, but because of what they choose to do with their heart. And in that truth, they found a life worth living, surrounded by love, peace, and a future shaped by hope rather than fear.